Welcome everyone. In this presentation, we will walk you through the guidelines on sharing interoperability solutions, what they say, how they work, and what they mean in practice. The aim is to provide a clear and practical overview of how public organizations can approach the sharing, publication, adaptation, and reuse of the interoperability solutions under the Interoperable Europe Act. Before we move into the substance of the guidelines, let me briefly set the context for this presentation. This presentation formed part of a broader program of implementation support around the Interoperable Europe Act. The objective is to help public organizations understand how the new guidelines can support them in applying the Act in a consistent, proportionate, and workable manner. The guidelines are designed as a practical reference point. They translate the relevant provisions of the Act into operational pathways, examples, and implementation guidance that can be used by public administrations and other stakeholders involved in interoperability. So in the presentation, we start with the guidelines themselves, what they cover, how are they structured, and how the six practical pathways are organized. And then we finish with some procurement aspects and key takeaways. And let us begin with the guidelines themselves. Their purpose is to support the practical implementation of the sharing and reuse provisions introduced by the Interoperable Europe Act. The idea behind the guidelines can be summarized as moving from build once to reuse across Europe. Basically, in other words, when interoperability solutions already exist and can support cross-border digital public services, public organizations should be able to identify them, access them, reuse them, and, where relevant, adapt or further develop them. The reason behind the guidelines is that the Interoperable Europe Act creates the legal framework, while the guidelines help organizations apply that framework in practice. 2 points are important from the start. The guidelines do not create new legal obligations, and they do not replace union or national law. Instead, they sit alongside the applicable legal framework and provide practical support for its implementation. The legal grounding is shown on this slide as well. Article 47 mandates the development of guidelines on the sharing of interoperability solutions. Then Article 15.5n gives the Interoperable Europe Board a role in identifying best practices for integrating interoperability solutions into public procurement. And last but not least, Article 8.1f provides that the guidelines are related and related case studies are to be hosted on the Interoperable Europe portal. Finally, important to mention, the guidelines were approved by the Interoperable Europe Board on 19 May 2026, and they are therefore intended to serve as an implementation support instrument, helping public organizations apply the Act in a consistent, transparent, and operationally workable way. So to talk about the structure of the guidelines are structured to move from general context to practical application, as mentioned multiple times. They begin with key concepts and definitions, followed by the governance model and the roles involved in sharing and reuse, and then introduce the operational entry points and life cycle for sharing and reuse before moving into the six practical pathways which form the core of the document. The guidelines also include a chapter on integrating interoperability solutions into public procurement, as procurement decisions often determine whether a solution can later be shared, reused, or adapted. The annexes provide additional supporting material. There are two complementary versions of the guidelines. The extended version provides the full guidance framework, including governance, procurement, examples from practice, and annexes, basically what we mentioned before. The short version focuses more on the practical pathways and is intended as more streamlined companion for day-to-day use. Both versions are available through the Interoperable Europe portal. This slide presents the main actors involved in the sharing and reuse of interoperability solutions. Each has a distinct role. The Interoperable Europe Board, to start with, has a strategic and coordinative role. It does not deal with the individual sharing cases. The European Commission provides and operates the Interoperable Europe portal, publishes Interoperable Europe solutions, and supports the overall visibility and accessibility of solutions. Within the union entities, interoperability coordinators play important operational role. They help coordinate internal decision making on how to share solutions, align sharing decisions with security considerations, and act as an escalation point where needed. At member state level, competent authorities and single points of contact support coordination on the Act, Interoperable Europe Act, and help foster sharing and reuse across the public sector. At the operational level, the sharing entity is the organization that holds the solution and is asked to make it available. On the other hand, the reusing entity is the organization that requests and adopts the solution. The guidelines recognize two main routes for fulfilling the sharing obligation. Where applicable, first is the publication through the Interoperable Europe portal or connected portal, catalog, or repository. And the other way is the direct sharing upon request. We will come back to both routes in the pathways. So the pathways we talked about are the operational core of the guidelines. Each pathway translates a legal provision of the Interoperable Europe Act into a practical situation that public organizations may face. The pathways are not intended to be a rigid checklist. Instead, they help organizations identify which legal and operational route is relevant in a given context. For example, whether they are choosing between solutions or publishing a solution, responding to a direct request, adapting a solution, co-funding future developments, or connecting a catalog in the Interoperable Europe portal. This slide provides a map of the 6 pathways and links each of them to the relevant legal basis. For pathway 1, it is based on Article 4.6 and concerns the prioritization of solutions without restrictive licensing terms when equivalent options are available. Pathway 2 is based on Article 4.3 and covers the publication of interoperability solutions through the Interoperable Europe portal or connected portals, catalogs, and repositories. Pathway 3 is based on Article 4.1 and deals with direct sharing upon request. Pathway 4 is based on Article 4.4 and concerns adapted interoperability solutions. Pathway 5 is based on Article 4.5 and covers voluntary cost-sharing agreements for future developments. And finally, Pathway 6 is based on Article 8.4 and explains how portals, catalogs, and repositories can be connected to the Interoperable Europe portal. A critical point is that the pathways are situational, not sequential. More than one pathway may apply at the same time, and several may apply across the life cycle of the same solution. This is important because in practice, sharing and reuse are rarely linear. linear. A solution may be selected, shared, adapted, published, further developed, and then reused again by another organization. So let's move to the pathway one, which concerns the prioritization of solutions without restrictive licensing terms. This pathway applies when a public organization is deciding whether to implement an interoperability solution, comparing candidate solutions, or determining the licensing approach for a solution that it intends to make available for reuse. The key point here is equivalence, where a public organization is choosing between possible solutions. It should assess whether a solution without restrictive licensing terms is equivalent to other available options. The relevant criteria include functionality, total cost, user centricity, cybersecurity, and any other objective criteria that are relevant in the specific context. Equivalence, however, does not mean that the solutions must be identical. It means that they are sufficiently comparable to meet the organization's needs. Where a non-restrictively licensed solution passes that test, it should be prioritized. This supports reuse, adaptation, and redistribution, while also helping to avoid duplication and reduce dependency on unnecessarily restrictive solutions. The implementation guidance follows 5 steps. First, to identify the relevant implementation decision. Second, to identify candidate solutions and prepare a shortlist. Third, to assess equivalence and operational feasibility. Fourth, to apply the prioritization rule and record the rationale. And fifth, to choose a license and manage compatibility. To underline with a practical example for the final step, choosing a license and managing compatibility, the guidelines also point to practical support tools available through the Interoperable Europe portal. One of these is the licensing assistant, including its compatibility checker. This tool is intended to support users when comparing, selecting, and combining open source licenses. In practical terms, this helps organizations manage licensing choices more clearly and reduce uncertainty when they want to reuse, adapt, or combine solutions. The key message here is that prioritizing non-restrictive licensing is not only a policy objective, it also requires practical checks, especially where several components, licenses, or reuse conditions may interact. Moving to pathway 2, concerning publication, it applies in 3 main situations. First, when a public organization fulfills the sharing obligation by making a solution publicly available. Second, when it wants to enable reuse at scale beyond bilateral sharing. And third, when an adapted solution must be published because the original solution was already made public under Article 4.3, which we will get into a bit later. Publication supports broad discoverability and reuse, of course. It helps reduce publication across the public sector, supports collaboration and community contributions, and can contribute to digital sovereignty by making reusable public sector solutions more visible and accessible. First solution to be accessible through the Interoperable Europe portal, several conditions should be checked. There should be no blocking third-party rights, no personal or confidential data, reuse permitting license or open source license, regular maintenance by the owner, and high level alignment with Interoperable Europe solutions. The implementation guidance again follows 5 steps. First, confirm that the publication is the appropriate route. Second, run the portal readiness check. Third, prepare the publication package. Then fourth, either publish the solution directly on the portal or through a connected repository. And fifth, maintain the published solution over time. Again, the Interoperable Europe portal provides support resources to help public organizations and solution owners with publication. These include eligibility criteria, practical guidance, how-to articles, and information on roles and responsibilities. When publishing, there are two main options. A public organization may publish directly on the portal, or it may request the Commission to publish the solution on its behalf. If the solution is published through a connected portal, catalog, or repository instead, the key requirement is that the connection is real, stable, and maintained. This is important because publication is not only about making a file available once. It is about making the solution discoverable, reusable, and properly maintained over time so that other public organizations can identify it, understand it, and decide whether it can support their own needs.
So pathway 3 is direct sharing upon request. So this pathway applies when someone has asked for your solution and you are sharing it directly rather than publishing. There are three exceptions that can apply. The first one is if the solution falls outside your public task, but that must be transparent and reviewable. Second case is if third-party IP rights restrict sharing for reuse. And then finally, if security grounds apply. This includes sensitive information relating to critical infrastructure, defense, or public security. Where an exception only covers part of a solution, then partial sharing may still be possible. Where sharing proceeds, reuse conditions should be specified, for example, support stance, maintenance, and liability. And also, the reusing entity must, upon request, provide an autonomy assessment, covering, for example, its ability to manage the cybersecurity and the evolution of the solution independently. Such assessment must remain proportionate, so it cannot become a barrier to sharing. For this pathway, there are 8 main implementation steps, starting with register and validate, then confirm scope, screen exceptions, assemble the package, set reuse conditions, decide on autonomy assessment, and finally deliver and close the request and keep a minimal audit trail. A good example for this pathway is Oskari, which is a solution that provides documentation in English, Finnish, and Swedish. And this is a very good example of how multilingual documentation can lower the barrier to cross-border reuse. In cases where full translation is not feasible, there are also machine translation services that can help and support. Two main points to underline for this pathway are, first of all, that the Act sets no deadline for responding and no mandatory format. And then, second of all, that the obligation is to share the solution as it exists, not to upgrade or improve it first. Pathway 4 covers adapted interoperability solutions. So this pathway applies when you have modified a solution for your own needs or when there is a question about whether the adapted version must be shared. The publication trigger is the key rule in this case. So if the original solution was published, then the adaptation must be made public in the same way. And in the same way means the same route, so either portal or connected portal, not necessarily the exact same repository. If the original solution was only shared directly, then publication is optional. There are 3 main points to keep in order throughout this pathway. First of all, documentation and provenance. For example, recording what you changed and why. Then a legal and rights check, verifying IP restrictions and license compatibility, and finally a maintenance plan, including how you will track upstream updates. There are 7 steps to follow for the implementation of this pathway. So first of all, identify the upstream solution, then check the legal framework, carry out and document the adaptation, decide whether publication is mandatory, prepare the package, publish or share, and finally manage maintenance and future evolution. A good practice for this pathway is provided by Consul, which is an open source participatory democracy platform that was designed from the outset to be reusable and adaptable. For example, the city of Groningen adapted it to their governance model and local needs. Here, it's interesting to see how each adaptation becomes a richer resource for the next organization that picks it up. So pathway 5 is cost sharing for future developments. In this case, the key word is future because this pathway applies only when organizations decide to jointly fund new features, scaling, hardening, or localization. It does not cover the baseline solution that already exists and not even routine running costs. Cost sharing agreements can look in different ways. For example, agreements could cover scope of developments, cost categories, governance, licensing, duration and exit strategies, or liability. It is important for this pathway to lock in the licensing approach for new deliverables upfront. There are three main steps here. So starting with confirming the funding is for future development and not basic sharing. Then agree on the core terms of the agreement. And lastly, deliver, publish where relevant, and review, keep the agreement up to date. A straightforward example of what this pathway could look like in practice is Zendis. Zendis is Germany's Center for Digital Sovereignty that together with France and the Netherlands co-founded OpenDesk. OpenDesk is an open source workspace suite. So these countries jointly funded core libraries, including a collaborative writing application. And regarding the allocation of resources, the contributions here were both financial and in kind. Finally, the last pathway, pathway 6, applies if you operate a portal, catalog, or repository with similar functions to the Interoperable Europe portal. In this case, the Act requires you to ensure interoperability with it through necessary and proportionate measures. There are two main connection models. The first one is manually created entries for interoperability solutions, or there is also federation, which is an automated metadata exchange via API and the use of public code YML, as it is used, for example, in the EU OSS catalog. There are three main points to ensure. So first of all, portal conformance for exposed entries, operational reliability, such as table identifiers, maintained connections, and also if your portal collects open source solutions, then the EUPL must not be excluded. This pathway includes 7 main implementation steps. So first, confirm the scope, then choose your connection approach, either linking or federation. Check which entries can be exposed, establish baseline content and metadata, implement the chosen connection, ensure that the EUPL is not excluded when open source solutions are collected, and finally, test and maintain interoperability over time. As just mentioned, the EU OSS catalog federates open source solutions from both national and local catalogs across member states. To integrate a portal or catalog with the EUSS catalog in practice, you need first of all a public Git repository, then a valid public code YML file, and a publicly accessible API. These are the specific operational conditions of the EUSS catalog, so they do not constitute a general legal requirement of the Act.
The following 3 slides concern integrating interoperability solutions in public procurement. This is linked to the Chapter 4 of the guidelines. Chapter 4 starts from a very practical point, namely that interoperability is often decided long before a system goes live. It is decided when certain decisions are taken, when the public authority defines its needs, drafts the specifications, evaluates offers, and signs the contract. This slide shows that logic is a sequence. First, the authority defines the need and scope. That means what systems, data flows, and organizations the new solution must interact with. Then, it considers whether an interoperability assessment is needed, especially where the procurement may affect cross-border digital public services. The results of that early analysis should not remain abstract. They should feed directly into the technical specifications. That means standards, APIs, data models, semantic mappings, and portability requirements. Then, award criteria can be used to reward offers that go beyond the minimum. Finally, the contract must secure the practical conditions for reuse: documentation rights, handover, exit support, and monitoring. The core message of the slide is that interoperability is not one isolated requirement. It has to be carried through the whole procurement chain, from planning to implementation. The second slide translates the chapter into three practical messages for public buyers. First, plan early. The guidelines encourage authorities to screen whether the system may affect cross-border interoperability, to map data flows and dependencies, and to check whether existing European standards, tools, or building blocks can be reused before creating something bespoke. Second, specify and evaluate clearly. The procurement should avoid unnecessary vendor-specific requirements and focus on functional outcomes. In practice, this means recognized standards where available. Also, documented APIs, structured data formats, and clear semantic alignment with EU data models or well-documented mappings. Third, secure reuse over time. Here is where the contract becomes essential. The authority should not only buy the initial delivery, but also make sure it can export data, access documentation, transfer knowledge, change provider, and maintain or adapt the solution later. The takeaway of the slide is that procurement can either build interoperability in or lock it out. Once the contract is signed and the system is implemented, weakness in portability, documentation, or rights become much harder and more expensive to fix. Keep that in mind. This final slide focuses on award criteria. The guidelines make a useful distinction here. Technical specifications set the minimum baseline, while award criteria allow the authority to reward better quality and interoperability. The first column is about designing fair criteria. They must be linked to the contract subject, measurable, transparent, and open to equivalent solutions. This is important because interoperability criteria should improve the procured solution, not favor one vendor, brand, or technical route without justification. The second column shows what can be scored. For example, bidders can be rewarded for stronger alignment with standards and EU data models, better API documentation, versioning and test environments, stronger data portability, and clearer rights and handover arrangements. Third column is about long-term viability. A reusable solution is not only about the initial technical delivery. It also depends on modular architecture, replaceable components, a credible maintenance model, update procedures, change management, and continuity of documentation. To sum it up, use mandatory requirements for what is essential, but use award criteria to reward the offers that make interoperability easier in practice, that make it more portable, more maintainable, less dependent on one provider, and more reusable over time.
We have now arrived to the main takeaways. There are 5 things to remember. First, Article 4 is the legal architecture. The guidelines are the practical direction and they do not include any new obligations. Second, sharing goes beyond access. Solutions need to be structured, documented, and usable. Third, the pathways are situational and not sequential. These should be applied proportionately. Fourth, governance and clear decision-making are what make implementation coherent. And finally, reuse should be built in from the start and not retrofitted. Thank you very much for your attention. For further details, we invite you to read the guidelines on sharing interoperability solutions, as well as explore our portal collection for further resources.